In the progressive religion which dominates the modern West, African Americans are a sort of sacred caste. It's been socially taboo to criticize them. We need to redistribute resources to them. The entire culture has been built around furthering their interests. When they fail, the standards that were used to measure their failure need to be removed, and we need to restructure our entire civilizational operating system off what leftists think Black Americans want. The thing I've noticed here is that almost none of this is actually about Black America. One of the points that brilliant Black authors made in the last century, such as James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison, is that the dominant theme of Black America's history is their dehumanization. That's something I keep seeing with the current narrative about African Americans. Whenever the left, and thus our society in general, talks about African Americans, they never see them for what they are. Rather, whatever mental projection helps them strategically in order to gain more power or lessen their own guilt as much as possible. I'm from Philly, a plurality Black city, and one of the highest concentrations of African Americans in America, surrounded by a state which is 95% white outside the major cities. What I tell my friends who are from states further north, which is where progressives tend to be concentrated, is that they don't actually understand Black culture. That since Black America completely changes its character once Black people become around a little bit more than a quarter of the population of any given area. This is why the Black community in Boston is so different from Philadelphia, Minneapolis versus St. Louis, or Seattle versus Los Angeles. What this means is that most leftists never actually relate to Black people as they truly are. This bugs me since I've consistently said before that the greatest issue modernity has is dehumanization, and I think Black America is probably the best example of this. Lots of the issues that later faced the rest of the population started with Black people, which is something that anthropologists have known for decades. This is my best attempt to create a history of Black America as a culture from Jamestown to the present. I will try to illustrate how Black America evolved into its current form and what that means. I know that our social order is completely hysterical about white people talking about Black people, but I think we all know that that's just silly at this point. I don't even think the left believes it anymore. They just use it strategically to get power. Our culture is trying to create a sort of racial caste system in which only people with certain immutable hereditary traits can speak on certain intellectual topics. This is clearly just a cynical power grab by the left, which is at complete odds with logic or the Western tradition. Last time I checked, our society, including supposedly the left, thought racial caste systems were bad. The left supposedly built their entire system around avoiding racial caste systems. I refuse to honor this evil and silly system. As you folks might know from my previous videos, I think the world is too complicated and too many people lie these days that I'm just going to state what I believe to be the fundamental reality of the situation without putting on 5 layers of deception and obfuscation. As we will see later in this video, the people most hurt by the layers of deception around Black America are Black Americans themselves. Part 1. Slavery. Black and white Southerners are inextricably linked. They form the South together at the same time, and it's impossible to understand one without the other. There were a few African slaves at the first English colony ever in America with Jamestown. The thing to keep in mind is that Southerners can pretty convincingly claim to be a separate nation or ethnicity from Northerners, in that the genetic differences between Northern and Southern British Americans are comparable to those between different European countries. Until the World Wars era, the northern states were nearly 100% white, with a few exceptions, while blacks were around a third of the South's population. Almost all African Americans were concentrated in the South for most of American history, and especially so the southernmost region of the South, or the Deep South. Even today, a majority of African Americans live in the former Confederate states, although there has been a huge migration across the country, mostly going to the Rust Belt, in which inner cities have become plurality black, surrounded by almost entirely white suburbs or countrysides. On top of this, there has been a migration of blacks to California, especially so Los Angeles, while most of America has at least some black people. Black authors have spoken before about how wildly different the context is between blacks in the South versus the rest of the country. In the South, Africans are a rural part of the land and culture with extended social networks that go back centuries. Although the South has had a lengthy history of pretty brutal discrimination against the Africans, they have put down roots there in a way they haven't elsewhere. From both objective data and anecdotal sources, the South isn't more racist than the rest of the country today. This concentration here is why so often the national hub of black culture is in the former Confederacy, whether Houston, Memphis, Miami, and Atlanta. One of the most insane things about wokeness, which is downstream from how the US government processes legal discrimination claims, is that wokeness demands every high-value industry have a racially proportionate structure to the national race statistics. Firstly, this is just a complex patronage system for the left to put their coalition in positions of social and economic authority. Secondly, they don't actually stand for the real balance according to racial statistics, where they're just pushing against white men's enfranchisement in every part of life. They go beyond what the 13% black stats for the entire country are, with 40% of major Hollywood roles now being black. However, the insane part of this is that America is incredibly racially diverse by region. Huge parts of America have practically no black people, and so expecting them to fulfill the national quota is just insane. Black people are 12% of America's population, and people always radically overestimate how much of America is black. For a frame of reference, there are more Americans with ancestry from the British part of Northern Ireland than there are African Americans, and there are 5 or 6 whites for every black person in America. Outside the South, Africans are practically a purely urban people who never really assimilated or related to that local area, much like the Muslims inside Europe today. Pennsylvania is a pretty de facto segregated state in which whites and blacks inhabit their own worlds and areas. In the South, there's more social understanding of the intertwined nature of whites and blacks, which goes back centuries, but is also steeped in racism being an integral part of that social structure. Interestingly, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X both thought the plight of blacks was worse in the North than the South for these reasons. It's also why black people have seen a migration back to the South over the last few decades. The reason that African Americans were and still are predominantly in the South is climactic. Most of the American South is to the latitude of Africa, and now that I live in Texas, I'm frequently shocked that North Europeans live at the latitude of Cairo. I keep getting tripped up by the lack of a winter here. On top of that, the American South used to have horrifying diseases. The sub-Saharan Africans had immunity to these, given most of these diseases were of African origin and were imported into the New World by Africans used as slaves by the Europeans. What then occurred is that the tropical New World gained these African illnesses, so Europeans had to import even more Africans on a practically industrial scale to habitate the region, given even the local Native Americans found them uninhabitable due to the new illnesses. The son of one of my favorite historians, who is also a historian, who I will call McNeil the Younger, wrote a book called Mosquito Empires, which talks about the effects of the spread of African illnesses to a region which he calls the Greater Caribbean. or a territory with a warm, wet climate that stretches from the Chesapeake to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This region became very inhospitable for Europeans who had not evolved for said African illnesses. For example, European powers would frequently send flotillas of 40,000 men to conquer the wealthy Caribbean sugar islands, only for, in most cases, 60 to 80% of the men dying of tropical illnesses within the first few months. This happened dozens of times at least. On top of this, these diseases are just truly horrifying. I talk a lot about the negatives of modernity, but stuff like removing dengue, yellow fever, malaria, or sleeping sickness is something that modernity did, which is ostensibly amazing, which we have practically no gratitude for. For lots of these illnesses, at best, if you survive malaria, you will experience lifelong lethargy if you don't die, and at worst, you will vomit out your entire body with blood or black pus through the multi-day torture before dying that is dengue, or just passing out forever in your sleep with sleeping sickness. Europeans were understandably terrified to go to the tropics due to these illnesses, and the fact that they ever did is a marker of enormous courage. Again, most people who went to the tropics experienced these illnesses in one way or another. After the first generation experienced them, they would pass immunity down through the generations, through mother's breast milk, so even white Southerners gradually gained immunity. This turned out to be decisive in several wars where, in the American Revolution, for example, the local Americans had a marked disease advantage over the British in the South. For certain stretches of the 17th century, as many British would migrate to the Caribbean as America, but most of those people died of disease. The culture of the American Deep South, unlike the rest of the eastern half of America, does not stem from certain diaspora cultures back in Europe, but instead from the white population of Barbados. Barbados was majority white in the mid-17th century, but then due to the rise of African diseases and the shift from tobacco to sugar agriculture meant that said white Barbadians migrated to the Deep South. Starting in South Carolina, they established a distinct American culture, which was instrumental in the creation of lots of modern American culture between rock, blues, jazz, fundamentalism, barbecue, and other things. This culture, based originally around Charleston and Savannah over the early Republic period, spread west through states like Alabama, Mississippi, and out to East Texas before fizzling out at the Great Plains, which can't support plantation agriculture. This region was 80% black during the colonial and early Republic period. Africans here worked as slaves on first indigo, rice, and some sugar plantations. After that, this region became completely dependent on cotton production in the 19th century to supply for the Industrial Revolution. The other main region of the South in which Black Americans lived was the Greater Chesapeake. Unlike the Deep South, the Tidewater culture of the Chesapeake region, like Virginia or Maryland, was based out of the South English nobility, who after losing the English Civil War to the Puritans, fled to the American South to recreate the English aristocracy on new land. The problem was that labor was scarce enough versus the land that they couldn't get whites to work the land as their tenant farmers like they would back in England. Thus, they started importing African slaves. David Hackett Fischer, one of the best authors on this topic, says that the culture of the American South existed beforehand, stemming back to England, while Africans were brought in order to maintain it. Virginia started out as the main hub of the South earlier, but with the invention of the cotton gin and the frontier over the course of the 19th century, the main locus of the South ended up around the Gulf. Virginia had the largest diaspora of any state in the country, populating a huge region stretching out to Texas, the southern Midwest, Tennessee, Kentucky, and even a few places in the American West. This caused strange dystopian effects in which in the Upper South they would have slave breeding programs and then migrate them down to the South or West. There were several population concentrations of different types of Africans in the American South. Not all Africans were seen as the same, with slave owners preferring different ethnicities of Africans for certain roles. In the Chesapeake and its diaspora, Nigerians were predominant. Nigerians make up a plurality of African ancestry in America, with the Igbo and Yoruba being the largest. There were some Muslims from further north in Africa, and so colonial Southerners were not unfamiliar with Islam. The reason for this is that the Igbo and Yoruba were seen as unusually rebellious and freedom-loving as Africans. They lived in proud city-state cultures. The Chesapeake's main crop of tobacco wasn't expensive enough to buy more compliant slaves. Certain elements of American cowboy culture stem from African cowboys in the Sahel. The Deep South with Carolina and its diaspora pulled more so from the Congo and Angola. They were sourcing these from England's ally, Portugal's colony in Angola. The Congo was a brutal totalitarian state, which artificially kept its people in poverty, thus they were beaten down enough by their own social structure that they could be made more docile slaves. The crops in the Deep South were more valuable, and thus they could afford these types of slaves. Lots of elements of African American culture, including the drum beat for rock and roll, are from the mouth of the Congo River region. The third major population origin for African Americans is from Senegal, in either Maryland or Louisiana. In Louisiana, a French colony, and also the blackest place in the North American continent before Anglo-Saxon conquest, this was since the French had a colony in Senegal. In Maryland, it was since they made crops even less valuable than Virginia, where they could only afford to hire the rowdy, nomadic, grassland herder people, the Wolof, from Senegal. The Wolof constantly caused revolts in America and were considered one of the most difficult African peoples to deal with. Almost all African Americans' ancestors came over in the 18th century, since America banned importing slaves from Africa after the Revolution. The year the ancestor of the modern average African American came over is around 1750, and for white Americans, it's around 1790. Among the founding fathers, it was widely assumed that even among Southerners that slavery would be gradually abolished peacefully. This was since the institution had grown unprofitable, and the state of Virginia, which had the most slaves of anywhere in America, nearly abolished slavery in the 1820s, 40 years before the U.S. Civil War. Europe had not practiced wide-scale slavery since the Roman Empire, and we know from primary sources the Europeans felt enormous guilt over practicing slavery at the time. However, the invention of the cotton gin popularized slavery, which was an incredibly popular institution at the time of the U.S. Civil War in the South. This is a chart of the genetics of African Americans. African Americans are almost all what I call Greater Bantu genetically, since, keep in mind, Africa has more racial diversity than the rest of the world combined. America once sent an African-American diplomat to Ethiopia in the early 20th century, which Ethiopia took as an enormous diplomatic insult, since they are a completely different genetic racial group where they also enslaved the black Africans. Africans also have a significantly higher amount of Native American ancestry than white people, although only a few percentage points, given there was a much smaller Native American slave trade. Our current narrative of slavery is massively colored by propaganda, so much so that you should basically throw it all out now. I'm going to go through a lot of the mistakes people make on this topic. One of which is that there was an enormous amount of cultural and sexual mixing between whites and blacks during the time period of slavery. I've read a lot of books on this topic, which cover primary sources, and it was incredibly common to have incredibly close relationships between masters and slaves. Masters trusted slaves to feed them, dress them, and raise their children or live with them on a very intimate level. America's relationship with Africans is a caste system in which whites and blacks were kept at a cultural distance, in which race mixing was highly taboo. The South was obsessed with white women sleeping with black men, with the enormous pro-KKK hit, The Birth of a Nation, which came out around World War I being about it. However, at the same time, nearly a quarter of the African American genetic pool is of European origin. It was taboo to mention, but masters would very frequently have slave mistresses, including very important people like Thomas Jefferson. This is even more pronounced for the modern African American ruling class's ancestors. Thomas Sowell did an analysis of the most important African Americans and found that among Black American leadership, they were almost entirely either descendants from recent immigrants from places like the West Indies or Africa. For example, Barack Obama's father was a Kenyan Nilote, so he's not African American, or they had mulatto ancestors who were free before the Civil War, which made up around 10% of Black Americans at the time. As of the 1990s, when Thomas Sowell was writing, outside of entertainments or sports, almost no African American leadership had ancestry that were predominantly slaves in America before the Civil War. There's an interesting book called The World They Made Together, written by an Israeli historian, which talks about the relationships between whites and blacks during slavery. There's something profoundly humanizing about the book, since it covers both the profound inhumanity with which whites treated their slaves, with, on top of it, a tremendous amount of cultural mixing and intimacy. You'll see profoundly politically incorrect stuff, like it was common for slave women to try to seduce their masters as a way to have the only social mobility they could. On top of that, the author also covers how white American cuisine, architecture, agriculture, and religion all took on enormous African influences, something white Southerners refused to admit until quite recently. To shout out a point which lots of people harp on, but there's literally zero evidence for, is that the Jews were not instrumental in the slave trade in any way. Western Europe and its diaspora had practically no Jews in the early modern period, given they had evicted them in the High Middle Ages to the ghettos of Eastern Europe. There were a handful of Jews involved in the slave trade, but they weren't a sizable portion by any way you could measure. This idea was made up by the radical black cult, the Nation of Islam, which ironically has very little relation to actual Islam. There's no evidence for the Jews being the predominant force of the slave trade. If you want to blame anyone for the slave trade, blame the Portuguese, who practiced by far the most brutal and largest slave trade of any European country. However, Africans were as instrumental to even more so in the slave trade than the Europeans were. The idea that you can divide the world into similar racial blocs which have shared interests and act together only makes sense in an American context. In the rest of the New Worlds, the other races are so mixed as to lose their clarity, while in the Old World, people of the same race constantly murder and compete against their own race. The vast majority of people involved in the African slave trade were Africans. The internal African slave trade was vastly larger than the Atlantic slave trade, coming in at 4 times the size, in which lots of the empires and states inside Africa were populated, majority so, by slaves. What occurred here is that due to globalization, Africa experienced profound instability in which they had population growth from new crops, the introduction of guns, and modern trade, which created a low-trust cycle in which African kingdoms constantly enslaved others to buy more guns and Western technology to fight their rivals. This destroyed the previous African social structure, being a tragedy of enormous proportions. Watch my video on the Atlantic slave trade on my wonderful second channel, History 102, if you want to learn more. Europeans never left the coast due to the horrible diseases, and so the Europeans would build forts along the coast. Africans would then sell their rivals to Europeans on said coasts, who would then ship them to the New World. The Europeans didn't originally enslave Africans out of racism, although over time they partially developed racism as a sort of rationalization for slavery, but since Africa fit a few of the characteristics they needed for slaves. The first, as stated before, was that the Africans were evolved for the tropical climates of the New World and against the diseases there. Secondly, Africa had never developed powerful states which would have protected their publics against mass slavery. Keep in mind that slavery and colonialism were not European, but global issues. The Muslims practiced the largest slave trade in history into the 20th century, which killed 5 million more people than the European one did. The largest source of Muslim slaves was Eastern Europe, where much of the identity and government of modern Russia was formed to fight off the waves of Muslim raids, which enslaved millions of Slavs. The Muslims only ended their slave trade when the West forced them to, and still de facto practice it now. I was watching this documentary of a Western journalist in Tunisia in the Maghreb, asking them about their slave trading history, and the guy they interviewed was just bragging about how his grandfather sold so many slaves and how awesome it was. Keep in mind, this is how most of the world still perceives these things these days. There was a huge crisis in Sudan in the 1990s as Muslim horsemen would raid into the south, now an independent country, enslaving the locals for the markets of the Middle East. The largest empires of the early modern period in sheer population size were mostly Asian, not European, while the Muslims practiced mass castration of their slave populations, which is why there aren't large black populations in the Muslim world, although they had an equivalently large slave trade. The Sahara was littered with millions of corpses, since most of the slaves who marched across the Sahara to the Muslim world died along the way. There were similar dynamics among the sugar-farming slaves of the other New World slave societies, like the Caribbean or Brazil. In these, the economic incentive was to import millions of slaves, in that America made up less than 10% of the total slave imports across the Atlantic from Africa. However, in the year 1800, America was the country in the world which had the most Africans, since only in America was the slave population replicable. This was since sugar, which predominated in the rest of the New World slave societies, is an absolutely brutal crop, while tobacco or cotton were more humane to farm. What was going on here is that in the Caribbean and Brazil, that slave owners would mass import black slaves, work them to death, buy more slaves with the money from this, in this horrifying cycle that consumed millions of people in the meat grinder that was sugar agriculture. America, not being a predominantly sugar-based slave society, had both benefits and drawbacks for the black population. On the plus side, African Americans were materially the best off of any slave culture. African Americans were better fed and housed than the peasantries of 1/3 of Europe, including places like Ukraine, Poland, or Ireland. That was since America was so wealthy that being at the bottom of American society was better off than being a few rungs higher on the social totem pole back in Europe. At the same time, since America was the main slave society in the New World, which was majority European, Africans were more controlled there than in the rest. In Brazil or in the Caribbean, the slaves were seen as just completely disposable, in which if they didn't die, they were allowed to maintain their culture or get positions of responsibility overseeing the other slaves. Periodically, even independence and rarely equality with whites. In parts of Latin America, black people could buy a certificate saying they were white. This was impossible in America, in which, due to the huge white population, blacks always remained at the bottom of the totem pole as a sort of untouchable caste. Untouchable castes are relatively common around the world, with India's Dalits being the easiest example, but others being gypsies in Europe, or even Japan has its own version. Ireland got its travelers. On top of this, genuine African culture was erased to a greater degree than the Caribbean or Brazil. You can see this in the greater popularity of voodoo, or African religious magic in those places. African Americans took English last names, converted to Protestantism, lost their African languages, and the like. One of the things Thomas Sowell writes out very eloquently is that lots of things which we associate with American black culture, like dialect or certain antisocial behaviors, can be traced back to a sort of Cockney, lower-class British culture in South England who lived with the African slaves. A lot of Ebonics is actually of South English origin. I think this sort of cultural death is more important than people realize, A people are rooted in their folkways, and so removing it creates a sense of cultural alienation and loss, which is difficult to articulate, but sticks with people for a while. All the wisest black thinkers stumble into this, or how so much of African culture has been destroyed by whites, leaving black Americans without a strong sense of identity. The thing is that even if the Latin form of slavery was more brutal, it was inefficient enough that blacks could keep more of their culture. The efficient capitalism the Anglo-Saxons had kept slaves on a tighter cultural leash than elsewhere. This is partly why black Americans see so many of the negative cultural effects of modernity earlier than other peoples who receive them later, which we will discuss further on in the video. Also, even though black slaves had higher qualities of living than a lot of European peasants, I wouldn't use this to say they had better lives, because freedom and self-respect are important things in their own right, where the nobleman is willing to die for his freedom since he holds it to be higher, and I think things like destruction of their culture or degradation or constant inability to control their own lives have negative effects psychologically that are difficult to measure or really keep track of. I mean, for an example that's way more tame, look at how helicopter parenting screwed over Gen Z. The more I read on this topic, the more I found that there are a few taboo points which authors on this topic keep stumbling on, but don't really know how to discuss politely. For example, I find it kind of funny that David Hackett Fischer was known for his brilliant book, Albion Seed, which is about how different British diasporas populated America, creating the different subcultures which still dominate American life today in almost every way possible. Back in the 80s when he released Albion Seed, he said the next book he would write would be on the cultural impact of African slavery on America. He waited 40 years to write that book, being African Founders. I was kinda disappointed since he's nearly 100 years old now, and so he'll never write the whole series on American cultural history, which I wanted so much. Where are the books on the cultural impact of the Catholic migrants to the Northeast, the settlement of the American West, or the American Empire? American cultural history is my thing, so if he wrote that series, it would have been incalculably valuable to me. I had already read a lot on this topic before I read African Founders a few years ago, and I had already stumbled onto the topics I knew he would have issues covering. I was curious how we would cover them, and I found he did a very good but sensitive job. The main issue authors stumble into while going into this field, apart from the politically incorrect things said already, is that lots of the antisocial behaviors we see from African Americans have cultural parallels in Africa. That's something which is completely obvious if you know anything about anthropology or human nature, but is somehow taboo to say in this culture. For example, crime and murder rates in America are correlated by race. White Americans have murder and crime rates identical to European countries, Asian Americans to Asia, and Africans to Africa. This is the origin of the whole meme that 13% of wizards cast a majority of spells, an indirect play on the crime stats in America. The thing to keep in mind is that cultural change has to be organic and stem from the context itself. People and cultures learn through experiences and making mistakes. Besides genetic differences, which we know with complete certainty do exist, but are too taboo to study scientifically now, so it's difficult to draw conclusions as to their scope yet, these sociological differences in development between Africa and Europe were great enough that they can't be bridged immediately. Furthermore, African Americans were largely not pulled from the more developed and urbanized African states in the Sahel, but from the jungle tribal coastlines. We see this easily in the tragedy that modern South Africa has become, or how you deal with different civilizations which are thousands of years apart in development, which require vastly different things for their own good. Sub-Saharan Africa, besides a certain amount in the Sahel, had never gone through a commercial revolution, the Axial Age, the rise of continental-sized empires, or the rise and fall of civilizations. This is just obvious, but it's taboo to say for some reason. But Different cultures at different levels of development need different things. It's more useful to see sub-Saharan Africa as part of the New World, or tribal cultures like Australia or the Americas, which were dragged into the global system by the European age of exploration, rather than Eurasia, which developed entrenched civilizations connected together by thousands of years of contacts. This is why it's so much easier for Indians, Middle Easterners, or Chinese immigrants to adapt to the modern capitalist market than Native Americans or Africans. It's not fair that these cultures were shoved into a global order, which they were never really prepared for, but life has never pretended to be fair either. All of these cultures are stuck with the issue of catching up to thousands of years of experience that Eurasia had, but they didn't. At least some Africans are making a valiant effort to do so today. However, in the grand scheme of things, the Africans have done significantly better than the Amerindians or Australian Aboriginals in the new global order, since they didn't die from European illnesses in the same way those peoples did. In fact, they unwittingly played the disease card on the Europeans in the way they did to those Aboriginal peoples. If you read enough on the anthropology of Africa, you will notice similarities in African Americans and Africans. This is something that the Thomas Sowell school of thought disagrees with, saying African Americans are basically Englishmen now. Although I respect Sowell enormously, this clearly isn't true. If you compare the behavior of African chieftains or dictators to rappers, there are similarities faced by the struggle of African Americans adapting to a very advanced, delayed gratification, capitalist educated society. For a frame of reference, if Irish or Italian Americans took a century to assimilate into Anglo-American society, of course Africans will face big issues. Part 2, Intermission. There was a hinge period in African American history after the North liberated them from slavery, but before the rise of their new patronage status in the liberal welfare state. This was a period in which I believe Black America could have made a better choice than what they did, where Black culture went through a period of profound introspection, which they later did not act on. The end of slavery was an artificial thing imposed by the North onto the South after a bloody war which killed over 1 million people. The Civil War was about slavery for reasons I explain in this text wall, which you can either interpret positively as the North trying to free the slaves, or cynically as the North trying to destroy the South's main economic or cultural engine. About a third of Southern whites owned slaves, and slavery was by far the most important element of the Southern economy or society. Slavery was wildly popular in the South before the Civil War. The end of slavery plunged the South into a century of poverty, backwardness, and cope, which ended after Jim Crow did in the 1960s. After this, the American South experienced one of the most rapid economic and demographic growths ever in history. The thing is that almost every people in history have practiced slavery. It's the norm with the societies which don't practice slavery being rare, although they do tend to be more successful and grow. The insane thing isn't that the West practiced slavery, but instead that they had a moral revolution where they not only abolished it itself inside their own countries, but also around the entire world. It's comparable to how almost every society has colonialism, and yet the West was the only one to end colonialism out of goodwill to let its former colonies gain independence peacefully, followed by sending Africa 20 Marshall's Plans worth of money to help them develop better. Listen here, the West was so insanely generous, but for the leftist critics, it's not enough, because it will never be enough. That's since their aim is the suicide of the West. Lots of Black primary sources speak of the period after the end of slavery as being more chaotic and difficult than slavery itself, although they were profoundly grateful for the end of slavery, a decision I of course support. That was since the South experienced a period of social chaos and breakdown. The North worked with Africans in the period after the Civil War. Lots of elected politicians in the South in the decade after the Civil War were black, where the Republican Party used blacks to win in the South. This was before the party shift of the 1960s, when the Republicans were the party of the North and blacks, while the Democrats were the party of Southern whites and Catholics. Black farmers did quite well in the short term, in which 1/3 of the state of Mississippi and the broader region were owned by black smallholder farmers. A black middle class developed in this era, with their own parallel economy. A lot of this was destroyed by the end of the Jim Crow era, in which the upper ranks of black society gained social mobility, entering into white society, leaving their co-ethnics back in impoverished ghettos with no leadership or role models. The northern conquerors in a few places experimented with dividing up the former plantations among black farmers. I don't fully trust the info here, since there's a lot of propaganda in this topic, but it seems to have worked out. However, the issue the North ran into is, since the US was a very small government country which didn't want to militarily occupy an area the size of Western Europe forever, the North gave the South self-governance back after a decade. I think this was a necessary decision to prevent the North-South division from fossilizing into an eternal hatred, but also the reinstatement of the old Southern social code meant a return to white supremacy, which was baked into the South's previous social structure. The old plantation system survived, with blacks alongside poor whites, often working as a form of serf called sharecropper, which were kept permanently in debt. The South adopted a legal code colloquially called Jim Crow, or segregation, which they maintained for about a century until the 1960s, when the North forced them to take it down. Jim Crow made it very difficult for blacks to exercise their constitutional right to vote, while creating two parallel societies under a facade of separate but equal. This meant that blacks were kept from eating at the same restaurants, going to the same churches, using the same water fountains, or sitting on the same parts of the bus as whites were legally. Black treatment was significantly worse than the white, while this killed off or heavily weakened the rise of a black middle or leadership class. Interestingly, the high point of racism in American history was not during slavery, but in the early 20th century around World War I. This was partly due to the rise of scientific concepts of race, alongside the lowering of average wages, which made normal people more tense. The KKK, an overtly racist secret organization, gained profound popularity and exerted significant social or political control over the South. Lynchings or vigilante hangings became quite common across the South, killing hundreds of blacks illegally, frequently those who were trying to rise above their station, who were called uppity. A strange irony here is that in this era of political and social repression, African Americans saw the highest increase in their quality of life of any era ever. From the period after the U.S. Civil War until the end of Jim Crow, Black America experienced an enormous increase in quality of life. In the period after the 1960s, black incomes have stagnated as the average African American has descended into far greater poverty than a lifetime ago. The reasoning for this is that black Americans follow the same economic currents as lower-class Americans of all races do, in that they're stuck in the same economy and they have the same trends. It's counterintuitive, but let me explain in this process how Black America's state has actively decayed over the last few decades. Part 3. The Welfare State. One of the points Ralph Ellison made in his book The Invisible Man, which has become one of the most important books in the African American canon, is that the lead, as an African American, is a tool of multiple factions of white, while being practically invisible as an actual human being. African American history has been marked by being part of the status structure of two different groups of white elites, those being the Southern whites and later with leftist progressives. Both of them caused different negative effects on the black community. Before I get started in a more complex theme, for a brief tangent, my high school got progressively wokeified, and the curriculum when I started had stuff like Shakespeare or Beowulf, but by the time I left school, they had replaced those with purely racial authors. This meant that in the last few years of high school, I read lots of black authors talk about the condition of that group in America today. What I found was that the first generation of black thinkers, like the Harlem Renaissance, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, Martin Luther King, or Malcolm X, even if I disagreed with what some of them said, they were actually articulate and intelligent. As of now, the current generation like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram Kendi are just pathetic grifters. They couldn't formulate a coherent argument even if they tried. It's also funny that these woke people go back to the first generation of black thinkers, and they think that the things they are saying actually play into the woke argument, which is kind of hilarious, because the older black thinkers like Martin Luther King or Booker T. Washington or Malcolm X wanted black people to further their own community and take responsibility for their own destiny, with establishing greater strength and ability as black people and not looking for whites for handouts. And they would be horrified to see the current state of the black quote-unquote liberation movement, which has basically just been free riding off progressive leftists. The mid-20th century was a turning point in black history for several different reasons. Partly, as alluded to before, black America saw a mass migration out of the South with the integration into an urban industrial society. You saw the end of Jim Crow, as well as their alliance with the left and the breakdown of the black social structure. The black migration to the Rust Belt helped kill that region. You saw the cities of the Rust Belt like Philadelphia, Newark, Cincinnati, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, and Cleveland go from easily the wealthiest places in the world to some of the poorest places in America. In Philly, half of the city is practically uninhabitable now due to crime issues. I remember when I was going to bike through some bad streets in a neighborhood that wasn't that safe as a teenager, my mom and sister literally burst into tears in front of me that I might die. Philly went from one of the wealthiest cities in America to the poorest and most crime-ridden of America's 10 largest cities. The left formed a coalition with blacks as a convenient demographic for the bureaucracy to justify constant growths in their budgets and interventions. The reason I say that is that none of the left's interventions to help black America actually worked, and in fact caused universally negative effects. Thomas Sowell has made a compelling case that the welfare state has caused more damage to the black social structure than slavery did. Something to keep in mind is that in the 1950s, the black community saw practically none of the issues it does today. Black families were 50% more intact than white families. Blacks did less drugs than white people, were more religious, and the crime rate was vastly lower than today. Something has happened in the last 60 years which has done enormous damage to the black social structure, since none of that is true today. One of the things that anthropologists have found occurs across the entire industrial world within the last lifetime is called anomie. Anomie is a term originally from French West Africa, which experienced identical cultural breakdowns as African Americans during the mid-20th century. Anomie is a cultural breakdown of social forms, with the family, religion, clan, and the rest all breaking down. The French noticed it, and then it applied to also the Jews very early, who experienced a similar cultural breakdown earlier than the rest of the industrial world, followed by spreading to the majority white populations. Todd Emmanuel, a French anthropologist who's known for his groundbreaking work on family structures, which I talk about in this video, has spoken about anthropological blackification, or cultural trends which start with black Americans, then spread to the broader white American population, and then the rest of the world. What's going on here is that black Americans are a sort of beta tester for the managerial social structure, given they were the most impacted by the new managerial welfare social structure. Black crime rates skyrocketed, with 1/3 of black men having a felony and half being arrested today. Blacks are 12% of America's population, but make up a majority of all murders. These statistics are not okay, and us enabling Black America in these crimes hurts everyone involved. Crimes are not caused by poverty. Upper-class blacks commit more crimes per capita than low-class whites. When white people experienced grinding poverty in the 19th century, this wasn't the effect. On top of this, other black social statistics are terrible. Blacks are 20 points poorer than white people are, with most of the very poorest people in America being black. Modern Black Americans have the highest rate of fatherlessness ever in human history, at nearly 80%. In a lot of America, more black babies are aborted every year than birthed. Black America would have double its current population if abortions were not legalized in the 60s. It's widely been said that fatherlessness in Black America stems from slavery. This is since slavery would break up black families and sell them apart. Slavery also emasculated black men by keeping them in permanent servility. I think this is probably true indirectly in that trauma in Black America does have horrible cultural PTSD, often only emerges once the trauma itself is gone. In addition to this, Africa itself has a fatherlessness issue, since the clan is so strong that the nuclear family never developed. However, more indirectly, the breakdown of the black family occurred at the exact same place and time as the rise of the welfare state. Fathers imprint notions of authority, discipline, and self-regulation on children. The collapse of the father in black households has created a highly toxic concept of masculinity, which you can see with rap. I think it goes unsaid how insane a lot of rap is, and how it promotes such remarkable degeneracy. Rappers frequently brag about murdering people, treating women as sex objects, committing crimes, and other stuff. We can't complain about the founding fathers logically and then let rap slide. Rap has become popular among people of all races while creating an enormously negative effect, since rap alleviates enough masculine angst in the worst way possible so that men don't snap and return to healthier concepts of masculinity like the nobleman, warrior, cowboy, or king. I've periodically tested this by just saying stuff rappers say in my life, with just egregiously bragging to see a reaction. As a white guy, I am universally treated with complete contempt for doing this, and yet people don't see the irony of the double standard of letting blacks get away with it. How does it make sense to have a society in which low-class criminals have more communicative ability than those who contribute to society? Dave Chappelle has made a bit about DaBaby, a popular rapper who literally murdered someone, as the story goes, with practically no consequences for his social standing. Well, until yesterday, if you said the slightest wrong thing about trans, your career would be over. Our society has no standards for Black America, which in turn ends up hurting blacks disproportionately more so than the wealthy liberals who push this. The white liberals are using this to virtue signal to get power, while the cost is borne by the black community. You can see that there was a negative shift in Black America which occurred within the last lifetime of music. Black Americans are the most musically and culturally successful group in American and possibly world history, having vastly more influence in those fields than their size or influence should normally allow. We can accept that Africans have an aptitude in music, but not that other ethnicities have aptitudes in other things. When I was in France, I saw the local youth listen to rap while wearing streetwear, and in China I stayed with a family where the son wore a Snoop Dogg t-shirt, without even knowing who Snoop Dogg is. I've spoken before about how the Uyghur Justin Bieber, who is now in a camp, cries, had a black guy rep him up at the start to give him more street cred, and Uyghur Stan is about as far away from the black belt as possible. Black American culture has gone global. When you look at the older black genres of music, they ultimately all stem from gospel or soul. This was from a Christian musical tradition, which was the case when the black community was more intact than the white. You first saw the move into jazz, rock, blues, disco, and R&B. It's remarkable to see how much musical degeneration occurred with the jump from R&B to rap. I've been listening a lot to older R&B, and it actually has instruments, tunes, story structures, while rap does not. It was often the same producers who worked in both of these industries. It's taboo to say this in our culture, but our descendants will be completely comfortable seeing rap as a sign of social and musical degeneration. They will be horrified at our apathy at seeing our own culture collapse. One of the hallmarks of decadence is the popularization of unsuccessful evolutionary strategies, since people brag in mating rituals by being inefficient on purpose. This is why people buy expensive clothes or cars, spend hours on the gym, or say stupid political positions to get laid. It's since the cost shows your wealth indirectly. This is a common anthropological principle when humans do not have enough suffering, where a good example being among the natives of the Pacific Northwest, who will periodically burn their possessions to brag about their wealth. Burning their possessions called potlatch is a social event for them. African American culture has been popularized partly on top of this due to our socialist, religious, and cultural structure because Black American culture has underperformed, much like how barbarian fashions were popular in the royal court as Rome fell to decadence. The welfare state has caused enormous damage to the Black social structure since Black America never had enough independence or status distinct from their previous untouchable status in a majority white society. White society took thousands of years of constant struggle to achieve its civilizational cultural level. Thus, when Black America was given an artificial influx of cash, it destroyed their previous social structures, which were built off the necessity of survival. Once the state paid for children, in that most welfare recipients are single moms, often of minorities, the women didn't need the men anymore. As the women didn't need the men committed more crimes. The upper class migrated out of majority Black areas, leaving the rest in a low-trust, envious environment. Growing up in school, Black kids would literally mock each other for getting good grades, since that was acting white. This is so counterproductive for no reason. There's an interesting study that became kind of famous, where they studied the children of Black soldiers who married German women and grew up in military bases where they had similar IQ and testing to white people back in America. So we know that the African American cultural context is doing something here. Keep in mind that this same mechanism also happened in the white community, which also experienced cultural breakdown or anomie due to the wealth of the post-World War II era. This isn't a race thing, but rather a human nature thing, where human nature is innately self-serving and strategic in its efforts. However, different ethnicities have trained their populations to have different levels of delayed gratification. As an example, the Scots-Irish of Appalachia, who are technically WASPs, have practically all the same issues as Black America, albeit not as bad. What the lefts did with Black America is what they do with every group they pretend to protect. They bribe their elite aspirants while abdicating responsibility, which then causes social breakdown of said group. This happened with the working classes or unions, as well as women and the Soviet Union. In each case, the left's rise to dominance caused sociological collapse, which destroyed said group over the course of a lifetime or a century. The average Black person lives a worse life today than decades ago by almost every conceivable metric. Beyond even the social stuff, the average Black American is significantly poorer, and inequality between them and whites has skyrocketed. The difference in income between white and Black Americans is significantly higher now than it was under Jim Crow. The reason that until recently the Democrats could count on nearly fanatical support from Black Americans is since they could bribe any aspiring Black person with enormous social advancement. In exchange for unquestioning support, these Black people got advanced, thus they could become loyal Revolutionary Guards in any institution for the left's self-interest. The thing with DEI, which aims at having as many Black people in positions of authority as possible, is that if you're an enterprising Black person, you will go very far. This is since most Black people are poor and not on the corporate route, which means that those who are in high demand. Meanwhile, lower-class blacks bear all the costs here. However, anyone who would have the effort to complain gets promoted inside the leftist system. Black America today is one of the most artificial cultures ever, although it grew into some organic roots in the South. They were ripped from their homeland, their culture destroyed, and then immediately jolted from legal untouchable caste to sacred for the new ruling religion of the society. I think it's worthwhile to have empathy for how difficult that would be for them to emotionally process. This is since America is such a dynamic and insane society that Black America is kinda along for the ride, but powerfully separated in a very profound way that both blacks and whites understand subconsciously. The thing about the current left-wing order is that it can't last. The welfare state is built off national demographics which no longer exist. We're getting too old to support it. Thus, this will all come crashing down soon. America is getting quite resentful of Black America free-riding off the left's delusions, which means Black Americans are given a choice today. Once their liberal masters can't maintain dominance, the great question is whether Black America can break out of dependency to actually be free. That's been their desire over their history. I know Black Americans want to be men, and the way to be men is to take responsibility. If Black America can learn independence, they can be respected, but if they go down with the liberal ship, they will forever be associated with it. The choice is theirs, and it's still open now.